Hello and welcome to lecture number 54, topic 4.1, the Negritude and Negrismo movements. There's two learning objectives, and the first one is describe the context of and connections between the Negritude and Negrismo movements in the first half of the 20th century. Both Negritude and Negrismo movements began in the early to mid-20th century. Negrismo emerged around the 1930s, as did Negritude. Both movements affirm the influence of African heritage and cultural aesthetics on many Afro-descendants throughout the African diaspora. This means they celebrated African culture and the art, music, and other elements that shaped their lives while mixing in with their new environments. Both movements reinforced each other and were influenced by the New Negro movement, which took hold in the United States during the 1920s. The New Negro movement provided a model for affirming Black identity through art, literature, and activism. This model included literary contributions by figures like Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Nella Larson, and Alain Locke, art by Jacob Lawrence and Augusta Savage, and activism by Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP. Some of the founders and main figures of Negritude and Negrismo were familiar with these American writers. For example, Nicolás Guillén, a poet associated with Negrismo, corresponded with Langston Hughes and later became lifelong friends with him. Hughes's poetry, often centered on African American life and pride, inspired writers and thinkers across the Caribbean and Africa. Negritude's main founders included Léopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal, Aimé Césaire from Martinique, and Léo Damas from French Guiana. They celebrated the richness of African culture and sought to reject the assimilationist policies of French colonial rule. Léopold Senghor later became the first president of Senegal. He infused his poetry with themes of African mysticism and pride, while also drawing upon his Catholic faith to emphasize unity. Negrismo, which emerged predominantly in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, focused on reclaiming African cultural elements that had been marginalized or erased by colonial and post-colonial narratives. Guillén's poetry highlighted the rhythms and experiences of Afro-Cuban life, blending traditional African influences with Cuban identity. These movements paralleled others around the globe, such as the Harlem Renaissance in the US and the Pan-African Congresses led by W.E.B. Du Bois. Their shared focus on pride and African identity and cultural reclamation helped lay the intellectual foundation for post-colonial movements across Africa and the Caribbean in the mid-20th century. Some of the similarities and differences between these movements and the New Negro movement were that they all emphasized cultural pride and the political liberation of Black people. However, they did not always envision Blackness or the relationship to Africa in the same way. This variation makes sense given that all of them stemmed from different experiences of being Black across various geographic regions. While all of them experienced discrimination or oppression to some degree, their relationship to Africa and their sense of Black identity differed based on their locations and the historical events that had transpired since their forced migration. For example, in the New Negro movement in the United States, Africa was often seen as a source of ancestral pride, but it was not always central to its vision. Often, Harlem Renaissance poems and writers explored a new African American identity. However, this vision was not monolithic. For instance, figures like Marcus Garvey looked at Africa as not just as their ancestral home, but also as a potential future homeland, promoting Pan-Africanism and the Back to Africa movement. This focus was deeply rooted in Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, which became the largest global Black organization in history during the 1920s. In the Negritude movement, writers and artists sought to reclaim and elevate African traditions and philosophies in opposition to colonial narratives that had demeaned them as backward or uncivilized. Leaders like Aimé Césaire and Léopold Sédar Senghor emphasized the richness of African heritage while challenging the cultural hegemony of French colonizers. Senghor, for instance, would later become the first president of Senegal, incorporating these ideas into national policies. Finally, in the Negrismo movement, writers emphasized the hybrid nature of Caribbean culture, highlighting their mestizaje, or blending of African, European, and indigenous influences. Similar to the New Negro movement, they explored what it meant to be both Black and Caribbean, but their focus was often specific to the countries in which they lived. For example, in Cuba, some of these writers explored the Cubanidad, or Cuban identity, and what it meant to be Black in that context. These movements shared a broader goal of redefining Blackness and affirming the dignity and richness of African and African-descended cultures while confronting oppression. However, the unique circumstances of geography, history, and culture led to different approaches and priorities. For instance, while the New Negro movement emerged during the Great Migration in the United States, a time when millions of African Americans were moving to urban centers like New York, the Negritude and Negrismo movements were shaped by anti-colonial struggles in Africa and the Caribbean. Now we're going to talk more about the Negritude movement. Negritude literally translates to blackness, and the term was coined by Aimé Césaire in Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal, which means Notebook of a Return to the Homeland. This movement was spearheaded by French-speaking Caribbean and African writers in the 1930s in Paris. Among the founders were Paulette and Jeanne Nardal, sisters from Martinique who ran a literary salon in Paris. These salons became vital meeting places where literary thinkers and activists gathered to exchange ideas. The Nardal sisters' contributions to the movements are often overlooked, but it was them who first introduced some of the Negritude writers and thinkers to works of Langston Hughes and Claude Maquet in their salon in Paris. They also helped launch literary journal L'Étudiant Noir, or The Black Student, which became a cornerstone of Negritude thought. When World War II began to impact Europe, many of these black writers and intellectuals returned to their African or Caribbean homelands, further spreading the ideas of the Negritude movement. This movement was both political and cultural, drawing significant influences from the Harlem Renaissance. Claude Maquet's If We Must Die and Langston Hughes' poetry became essential reading in their circles. The writers and artists of Negritude protested colonialism and rejected the forced assimilation of black people into European culture. Instead, they celebrated African art, history, and philosophy. A hallmark of their work was the use of surrealism, which allowed them to express the complexity of identity, memory, and liberation. This connection to surrealism was also influenced by interactions with André Breton, a French surrealist who supported Negritude writers. One example of the surrealism in art in Negritude is Wilfredo Lam's painting The Jungle from 1943, which incorporates surrealist techniques to depict the complex cultural and historical layers of the African diaspora in Cuba. The painting reflects the Negritude ethos, highlighting African cultural influences while critiquing colonial exploitation in the Caribbean. By the 1950s, Negritude ideas began to influence anti-colonial movements across Africa, with leaders like Senghor and Kwame Nkrumah incorporating its philosophies into their struggles for independence. Negrismo emerged in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean around the same time as the Negritude movement. The term also translates to blackness in Spanish and was a response to the marginalization of African voices in literature and society. This movement celebrated the African contributions to Latin American music, folklore, literature, and art. These influences are particularly evident in the rhythms of the music and the vibrant, symbolic styles in which the art was painted. One of the most famous Negristas, or Negrismo poets, was Nicolás Guillén. Guillén, widely regarded as the national poet of Cuba, produced two major works that exemplify the Negrismo movement. The first is Senseyama, which incorporates elements preserved in African religion in the Caribbean. The poem centers on a ritual involving the killing of a snake, serving as an allegory for the eradication of a dictatorship under which Cuba was suffering. This layered symbolism reflected not only political resistance, but also the preservation of African cultural practices that had survived centuries of colonial oppression. Senseyama, with its rhythmic cadence and invocation of ritual, became a powerful piece embraced by Black and mixed-race Latin Americans as it explored themes of dual identity. The music and dance styles of rumba also frequently appear as a recurring motif in Afro-Cuban poetry. These poems attempt to mimic the rhythms of rumba songs and dances, connecting the literary form to African-inspired musical traditions. Guillén's second major poem, Balada de los Dos Abuelos, or Ballad of the Two Grandfathers, delves even deeper into the theme of dual identity in Latin America. In this work, Guillén uses rhythmic patterns that echo African music and creates a dialogue between his two grandfathers, one who is Black and one who is Spanish and white. The poem alternates between the two voices, exploring their vastly different experiences while building towards a resolution that acknowledges and celebrates the mixed heritage shared by Guillén and others in the Caribbean. This duality reflects the broader mestizaje, or the racial and cultural blending that defines much of Latin American identity, particularly in the Caribbean, where African, Spanish, and indigenous influence is covered. Ultimately, the poem culminates in the creation of a new identity, one that reconciles these disparate elements into a unified whole. Guillén's work not only highlights the African influence on Cuban culture, but also critiques the racial inequalities that persisted in post-colonial societies. His poetry became a cornerstone of Cuban literature and a powerful symbol of cultural pride for the Afro-Caribbean diaspora. The second learning objective is explain why proponents of Negritude and Negrismo critiqued colonialism. In the 1930s, Cuba was under an oppressive dictatorship supported by the U.S. government even after the United States had technically relinquished direct control of the island. The roots of this control trace back to the Spanish-American War of 1898, when the U.S. fought Spain to liberate Cuba from Spanish colonial rule. However, rather than granting full independence, the U.S. kept Cuba as a protectorate under the Platt Amendment, which gave the U.S. significant influence over Cuban affairs. This policy ensured that American business interests, particularly in sugar and tobacco industries, were safeguarded, often at the expense of Cuban sovereignty. Meanwhile, Africa faced similar dynamics of exploitation under European colonial rule. By the late 1800s, the continent had been carved up by European powers during the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, an event often referred to as the Scramble for Africa. Following World War I, the collapse of empires and redistribution of territories led to further reorganization of African lands under European control. For example, Germany's colonies, such as Namibia and Tanzania, were redistributed to Britain and France under the League of Nations mandates, further entrenching European dominance. By the 1930s, the only African territory that had not been colonized was Ethiopia, though it faced threats from Italy under Mussolini's fascist regime. The writers and artists associated with Negrismo and Negritude rejected the colonial narrative that European powers had civilized the people they colonized. Instead, they exposed this claim as a facade for political and economic exploitation. Colonizers had justified their actions through the myth of racial and cultural superiority, but in truth, these systems served to extract wealth and resources from colonized people while oppressing them. These ideas are powerfully articulated in Aimé Césaire's essay Discourse on Colonialism. In his work, Césaire dismantles the notion of colonizers as civilizers, arguing that colonialism was a dehumanizing force both for the oppressed and the oppressors. He wrote, "No one colonizes innocently, no one colonizes with impunity either," highlighting the moral and ethical corruption inherent in the colonial system. The essay not only critiques the exploitative nature of colonialism, but also serves as a manifesto for anti-colonial resistance, inspiring generations of activists and intellectuals. Both Negrismo and Negritude movements drew on these critiques to reclaim the cultural and historical dignity of colonized peoples. Their works emphasize the resilience and creativity of African and African-descended cultures, directly challenging the European-centric narrative of progress and civilization that had justified centuries of oppression. Supporters of anti-colonialism in the Negritude and Negrismo movement found some allies in the United States among African Americans who critiqued global capitalism and racism. These shared struggles stemmed from their collective experience of systematic oppression, leading them to develop and employ forms of black radicalism as a response. For example, Marcus Garvey frequently emerges as a prominent figure in this context. His Pan-Africanism and Back to Africa movement exemplifies the global interconnectedness of black liberation struggles. Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association inspired not only African Americans, but also anti-colonial activists in Africa and the Caribbean, demonstrating the transnational reach of black radicalism. A lesser-known but equally vital figure in fostering these connections was Jessie Redmond Fawcett, the literary editor of the NAACP's journal The Crisis. Langston Hughes aptly described her as one of the midwives of the Harlem Renaissance, as she provided a platform for black writers during the 1920s, including writers like Countee Cullen and Zora Neale Hurston, by publishing and promoting their work. Through The Crisis, Fawcett not only amplified the voices of African American writers, but also introduced American readers to translated works by black writers from Europe and Africa. These texts condemned racism and colonialism, drawing connections between struggles against Jim Crow laws in the U.S. and anti-colonial movements abroad. In her own novels, Fawcett challenged monolithic stereotypes about black identity, portraying complex and nuanced characters. Her works explored themes of race, gender, and class, often engaging with the concept of intersectionality before the term was widely used. Her novel There Is Confusion and her 1928 work Plum Bun exemplified this approach. Plum Bun is the story of an African-American girl in Philadelphia who is of mixed race and has the ability to pass as white. Through this narrative, Fawcett explores the complexities of racial identity and the social privileges associated by colorism. The novel also delves into the psychological cost of passing, challenging readers to confront the pervasive racism and internalized prejudice of the era. Fawcett's work, along with their editorial leadership, bridged the gap between African American and global black literary traditions, underscoring the shared struggles and aspirations of black people worldwide. And finally, for the recap, Negritude and Negrismo emerged in the early to mid-20th century in French-speaking and Spanish-speaking black diaspora as political, literary, and cultural movements. Negrismo and Negritude were partially influenced by the New Negro movement and shared emphasis on cultural pride and black liberation. And finally, proponents of the movements critiqued European colonialism in the Caribbean, supported by African Americans in the United States. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/AFAM. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.